Welcome to the Teach Joyfully podcast, where we talk about all things elementary teaching with some mom stuff thrown in. I'm Lisa Burns, a teacher success coach, veteran elementary teacher, and mom of 5. I'll be your host. Thanks for joining me today. So for today's conversation, I'm talking to Loretta Oakes. Loretta is one of those people who is multi-talented and super humble. She is a mom of 3 amazing kids, a teacher, a published author, an engineer, an artist, a blogger, and a good friend. She has graciously agreed to chat with me about writing in the elementary grades. Thanks so much for agreeing to be on the show today, Loretta.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start by telling us a little bit about your writing experience and how you got started and that process?
Well, with me, Lisa, I always do everything backwards. So I took a class while I was pregnant with my first daughter on writing screenplays with a friend of mine from work. And so we wrote screenplays for a while. And that was a very interesting way to start, because then you really start with the characters and the setting and things like that. And then once I was done with that, I was like, wait a minute, it woke something up in me. And so I did start writing all kinds of things, articles for publications, blogs, and children's books and things like that. And I wrote and wrote and wrote. And now it's been 25 years that I've been writing. Yeah.
Wow.
It's a long time.
It really has been a long time.
Yeah, because somewhere in there, I had friends asking me, would I look at their manuscripts that they were going to publish? And I said yes. And then they started asking me to do interviews with people and then write about those interviews. And so it just sort of all blended in.
It did. Okay. So talk to me about your process when you are getting ready to write. Let's talk about a book, okay? Because most times we're talking with children and when we first start writing, we start with a narrative writing. So let's talk about writing a book or a short story and how that would translate into your teaching. Start with your process and then how you translate that into teaching.
So my process personally, and it will vary based on what I'm writing. If I'm writing a children's book, I'm going to have a completely different process than if I'm writing an adult novel. And that is something that I don't think a lot of people understand. I think some people think that when you just sit down, you're just going to start writing. And you're right. There is a whole process there. Plus, there are writers' conferences all the time. Why do you think that is? It's because even people who are experienced writers go to those writers' conferences because they're looking on how to hone in their process. So it's a constant thing of honing in your process. But if you're writing a narrative, like for a little person, the first thing you want to do is you want to just get them talking about what it is that they're going to write about, because we have these ideas in our head, but forming those ideas to put something on paper, that's a different part of your brain. So actually, a lot of writing has to do with focusing your brain. So there's actually 3 different processes. There's the process of the idea, the process of verbalizing, and then the process of writing it. And that's how it kind of works for young people, because they can't sit down. They don't have all their synapses in place to sit down at a computer and start typing everything that they're thinking. So it's a multi-layer process for them.
Okay. So what would be, when you think about that, think about what's the first step then? If you're going to help your students start to write, and they're going to write a narrative of some sort, what would be the very first step that you would have them do?
Honestly, I'd have them read, because reading actually then triggers their own memories and their own thoughts. Or something I've done with middle schoolers, which I think actually translates to younger students as well, is I will put up a picture of nature and I will say, start describing this picture, or what do you see in this picture? And it depends on the level of student. And you have all different levels, even in middle school, right? You have the kid that writes nonstop and he's in his head or her head writing all kinds of fantasy stories and fiction stories. And then you have the other kid who looks at that picture and says, I don't see anything. So you have to accommodate all the different types of learners and all the different types of thinkers. If I have a kid who looks at a picture and says, I don't know what to do with that, I say, start writing down words of things that you see. What color are the trees? Green. What color are the rocks? How many rocks are there? Start with that process. Then you can start building. But if you get a kid to sit down and you put a pencil and a piece of paper in front of them and say, write, they're going to go, what? And everything is going to go blank. So the first process is reading or seeing, and then they can develop their own thoughts from there.
Right. And I often start with a picture book that has maybe a similar topic about something we're going to write about,
Yes.
or it has something in it that would inspire them to write along the lines that I want them to write. Getting a
Yes.
picture. I love the idea of a picture. I think that's a great idea. You could even say, here's going to be your setting and here's the picture. And so you need to use this and let's describe this first. And then they could take off from there. It's nice to have something. And I know with young children, a lot of times we start with drawing a picture.
Yes, because what that does is that triggers the things in their head that they're associating with writing. And you have to accommodate different types of learners, whether it's a drawing learner that's artistic or whether it's a visual learner, right? Which is some of the drawing, but not necessarily. Those are actually two different things. So then you have the visual learner who has to see something. You have the audio learner who learns by listening. So you can play music that is of the same tempo of what you want them to write. And then you also do want to read. And if it's reading a picture book to little kids to get them on that topic and start thinking about it, actually, to be honest with you, that's what writers do. Professional writers, they have writing prompts every day that they sit down for 5 minutes and write based on that prompt. And then they're in the mode to do their regular writing.
So it's like a warm up.
It's a warm up.
Okay, so giving kids some sort of a warm up, and you can try different things to see what works for your students and for your class.
You should have multiple things in your arsenal to help them with, in your toolbox to help them with.
Right, absolutely. So once they're started writing, do you have a process for them to kind of figure this out? I mean, when you're writing, you're figuring out characters, you're figuring out all kinds of things. Even young children need something to kind of help them structure a little bit, don't they?
Yes, I think so. So really young learners like first and second grade, you can have keywords like first, this happened. Next, this happened. And then finally, this happened. And when you have those little trigger points for them, they can now put things in chronological order, which is important for later paragraph writing, honestly. So if you start there, then they can start processing their thoughts in order that makes sense. So all those little pieces do help. And you can give them a piece of paper that literally just has first, and then several lines that they can write, next, and several lines that they can write, and finally, then they write. We know as teachers, not every kid is going to write the same thing, and they're not on the same level. So having those extra lines, you tell them you don't have to fill them in unless you want to, but just write a sentence or two for each piece.
Sure. That's a great way to start.
Yeah. And there are books on this. Writing Revolution is a good book that helps organize teachers just as much as it helps organize kids for different writing events.
For sure. It's a great book. Okay, so once they have those basics down, then you can help them start to expand and add more detail and more information. And so how would you at that point start to teach them how to do that?
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. And there are there's a lot of different ways to do that. First off, I put a picture back up on the screen and I tell them, describe every single thing that's in that picture. Just describe. And I don't want nouns, I want adjectives. So you're starting to give me adjectives of what's going on. And then I'll put another picture of something active happening. And then I say to them, okay, I want you to list every type of active verb that you can write on this. And once I have those two things done, then I go back to them and say, okay, I want you to write in that first and next and finally, just start writing descriptive adjectives and active verbs for two of those three things that you have there. Because it's like painting a picture. On the canvas, you have multi-layers in your painting. And that's the way that writing should be as well. So One thing that students should learn early on, it's not a one and done. You're not going to sit there and write the whole thing and then just be done. It's not like math. 3 + 3 is always 6. The time that 3 + 3 is not 6, we're in big trouble. But that's not the way that writing is, right? Writing is such that it depends on how your brain works. So you have got to layer it like you layer a painting.
That's a great image that even a young child from kindergarten through fifth grade can really look at that and understand that because it is layering. That's a good way to think about it. I've never thought of it that way, but I think it's a really good image that helps kids understand that it is layering. You're putting on another layer and you're adding some little bit more detail each time that you go back to that painting or to that writing. You're adding
Yes.
another piece. I like the idea of pulling out and just doing active verbs and just doing adjectives first so that they've got a little practice in and they're warmed up for it, and then moving back to their writing and putting that in because their brains are warmed up for that piece now. And those pieces are so much easier once they've kind of got their brain around that. But you're not throwing everything at them at once because that's so overwhelming. I think sometimes as teachers, we do, oh, make sure you include this and make sure you include this. And then they don't do half of it. And then we're frustrated. But the reality is we gave them too much at once. If we can just give them the basic and say, get this down, and then you can move forward. And we're not going to do this with every piece students write because my kids write every single day.
As they should be.
Right. But you're going to pick and choose pieces, one or maybe two each month that you might actually develop in this way with them as opposed to always doing this. Don't you think?
Absolutely. I really love that you said that they write every day because we make them do their addition and subtraction facts every day. Why wouldn't we write every day? And I love the idea of journaling, but there is actually something called focus journaling where you give them a prompt and you ask them to write 2 sentences on it. And I think that that's a valuable tool as well, because when you're doing your math facts, you're going to come to an end. Part of writing is knowing when you've come to the end. And so if you give them pointed prompts, then they can write just based on that. And then they know they're done, just like when they know they're done with their times tables or whatever.
Interesting. So getting them to recognize an ending, which is interesting because now that you say that, I have had students throughout my career who just never seem to know how to end things. One, but also some kids who just keep going on and on long time when it should have ended and the story starts to ramble a little bit.
Yeah. We know that well just with each other, don't we?
That's right. It's hard to end things sometimes,
Yeah.
isn't it? Okay. So let's talk about, because you mentioned writing revolution, which I love, by the way. So let's talk about, we've talked about this process and how to do those things, and there's plenty more to talk about, but let's jump back just a little bit and talk about the idea of having some basic skills under your belt. We talk about writing every day. What about developing that sentence level? Even in fifth grade, a lot of times we have kids and we're jumped into third, fourth, fifth grade, we're in paragraphs, but their paragraphs aren't very good. And the problem isn't that they don't know how to write a paragraph. Actually, the problem stems from something much earlier, which would be sentences, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll be honest with you, I would say 85% of adults don't know how to write a sentence. So it's not just third through fifth graders. Sorry to offend all of us, but we are not all these lovely writers, even as adults. So yes. And how do you do that so that it's not drudgery? Because we have the ideas that you have to have a subject and a predicate and things like that. But you could actually, and I do this a lot, even with middle schoolers. I know we're talking about little kids, but honestly, middle schoolers and little kids are not that much different when it comes to writing. You still have to learn. So what you can do is it's a lot like putting a picture in front of them and telling them to describe the picture. You can give them what I call a subject predicate sort. And they have like a small baggie of subjects and a small baggie of predicates, and they just pull it out. They pull one out from the subject, they pull one out from the predicate, and they've got to write a sentence based on those 2 things. Now you come up with really silly sentences, but what they are learning is how to put those things together and that you need both. And that is the key. When you have that subject and predicate, then like for middle schoolers, then what we did was and you can do it with third through fifth grade too, You have a subject baggie and a predicate baggie and a maybe adverb baggie or prepositional phrase baggie, and it doesn't matter which one you pick out. You can't put it back. You got to use what you have to build that sentence. That actually also helps later with sentence diagramming, because now they understand innately what a subject is, what a predicate is, or what a verb is, what a preposition is.
What a great activity. I love that. I love that. I think that's fabulous. So, really working on that sentence level, but trying to make it fun and interesting. And I think that's a really fun way to do that. Or if you give students even the beginning of a sentence, or give them only the end of a sentence and they have to
Yes.
figure out the rest, that's another way to do that. But there's lots of ways to do that. And I think one of the things that I do as a quick write is simply have them write a solid sentence every day, an expanded sentence, something that's interesting and fun. And it can be silly and goofy and whatever. If it is, even better, because then we can all have a laugh, and I'm all about a laugh, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there is nothing better than a laugh in school, because then actually what that does is that creates a synapse in your brain that you remember that better as well. So I agree with that. And you can expand this to do vocab words. But as a teacher, if you say, okay, I want you to write a sentence on this with this vocab word, kids are going to go, oh my gosh, I have nothing. I got nothing, right? Everything goes blank. I got nothing. But if you say, I want you to write a sentence on this vocab word with this topic, and then you give them a sample of your own, then they have something to work on. And so once again, you're layering that once again for them, which, by the way, when we were talking about layering, there is nothing better than doing an art project with the young ones that show that layering. And it can be construction paper of different colors that you add on top to build. Maybe you're building a bumblebee and you have the black on the bottom, and then you add the yellow stripes, and then you add the eyes. It's the same concept that your brain then will understand about writing. I'm going to build this from the ground up.
I love that. I think that would be such a great way to explain the idea of adding detail to your writing, because you could talk about it as we're adding different pieces to that of art, which really for young children, especially, but even all the way through even middle school, really, they would understand that, and that would really bring that home to them. So that's awesome.
Absolutely.
So once they have sentencing down, and you will continue to work on sentencing, I think, throughout the whole year. I mean, even
throughout, yes.
I learned this from someone else for summarizing a 6-word sentence summary. So they have to summarize something in 6-word sentence. Oh my gosh. It's a lot of fun. And they come up with some interesting things, but they have to be very descriptive and choose their words very carefully in order to summarize even a chapter or a paragraph in 6 words in a 6-word sentence. And it's a real challenge, but once they've gotten good at sentencing, they come up with some really creative things. And I don't have an example with me right now, but I've seen a few 6-word summaries for entire novels, and oh, they are good.
I am sure. They even have contests for those kinds of things. How to write a entire story in 200 words. They call it flash fiction. So yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. So now that you've got a good solid idea of what sentencing is, let's talk about building your first paragraph.
All right. That first paragraph, not in an essay, but just a standalone paragraph, you want to give them all the tools possible to, once again, scaffold like you're scaffolding a building. And you got to have your cornerstone and your middle pieces and then your roof. So the same thing goes with writing, in that you have to tell them, you give them a formula. And I have a formula that I'm putting together to put on Teachers Pay Teachers for how to write a solid topic sentence. There's things that you want to put in that topic sentence. And even though you may be writing different things, you may be writing a narrative, you may be writing a review of something that's fiction, or a review of something that's nonfiction, or you're doing a biography, it doesn't matter. Your topic sentence has to tell the reader 4 important things about what you're going to write about. And you can do that all in one sentence. So you have your topic sentence. And then even in fiction writing, you do not write that first chapter first. You work out all the details of everything so that you know what that first chapter is going to be, and so that you know how to point your reader. So the first thing that you're actually going to do in writing a paragraph is you're going to have them find 3 important details. 3 important details on what they've read that stick out to them. There's a tool that has like an intro piece, and then it's got 3 detail squares, and then a bottom square for the conclusion. And you're just going to have them write ideas first. They're not even writing sentences, right? They're writing their ideas. Then once they have those, then they write a rough draft of their detail sentences. Then they write their topic sentence, and then they write their concluding sentence.
Sure. So they use a graphic organizer to.
Yes, graphic organizers are always awesome for this.
Yeah, I think we all use them to some extent. Some are better than others, but yes, I have some that I love. And so you've got the graphic organizer, and that's the planning piece and helping students plan. And there's only one writer I've ever heard speak who says that she doesn't plan. And that's Cynthia Ryland. She literally writes from beginning to end, but she is an anomaly. She is a unicorn. She is like the only people who does that. Everybody else has to do some sort of planning, and students don't always understand that. They just want to sit down and write it and be done with it and never get it again.
And then also for teachers, that can also be a problem, because then they write it, they hand it in. They don't even care what the grade is going to be. They're done. You give them feedback. You've taken all this time to go over it and grade it and give them feedback. And they look at it and they go, okay, thanks. And that's the last time they're going to look at it. And you're thinking, and that's another reason that you layer. That's another reason that you actually do a rough draft. And that's where the major grading comes in. And that's actually where I give the most points when I'm doing that, is in the rough draft, because I want them to see how to make that better. And if it's in a final piece, any student, even high school students mostly, will go back and look and see what your feedback is. So if you give it to them as a rough draft, then by the time they get to that polished last thing, it's so much better.
Because they've had to look at the feedback and use the feedback in order to create the final draft. It was valuable that they had to actually use it, as opposed to just, let me go see what my teacher said.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, my rubric for their final thing was, did you include any of the feedback that we talked about? So if you included any of that feedback in your final draft, I'm going to give you points for that, because that means you were listening.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. Okay, so you moved to that planning piece and then into your writing. And I love the idea of giving more of the points in the rough draft and in that editing and revising piece than you do in the final draft. I think that is really valuable advice, because so often we give them all the points at the end, when really the real work happens in the middle.
Yes, it does. Also, you're building synapses. And so if you give them all that feedback and you give them grades during that time, their brain is going to have synapses towards that as well.
That reinforces that process, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So do you use examples and mentor texts before you start actually writing and teaching paragraphing?
Absolutely. Because once again, you can't write unless you read. And reading is very important. Actually, what I love to do as we're going through reading is I actually love to pull out the bad examples, because I want them to see that these writers are not perfect. And so I'll say, ooh, gosh, look at that sentence. Could they have done that differently? Could they have done that in a better way? And we'll have a discussion on how could they have done that differently or more effectively. And then I will also then go pull out something that's a beautiful sentence and say, oh, do you see the image in this? And let's take a moment and talk about this image, or draw a picture about this image that was in your mind. And that's a valuable experience too, because what students don't understand is that the way that they've interpreted an image is not going to be the same way that their buddy has interpreted that image. And so if you have to draw a picture, you're going to have as many different students, you're going to have as many different pictures. So that can be a tool as well. So
Right.
Absolutely, mentor reading is very, very important. And finding good mentor text and finding multiple ones can be very helpful.
Would you say that you use mentor texts to also challenge students to not only notice things when they're reading, but also to challenge students to try new things? Do you use that as
Yes.
examples of things that maybe they could try out in their own writing to stretch
Yes.
themselves?
Absolutely. There are so many good mentor texts out there that I will say, okay, this is something that you can try also. But also, something else that I've done is when, how we have these things where we're like having kids make predictions. What do you predict is going to happen? Well, I take that a step further and I will say, okay, we're not going to read any more from this novel right now. You are going to write the rest of the story. And then when we read the rest, then we can go, oh, and then we'll share. And some kids will say, I like mine better than theirs. But what you've done is you've allowed them two things: to be themselves. You've allowed them to look at their own creativity and realize that their own creativity is valuable. It builds your self-confidence and it builds your self-confidence as a writer.
Yeah, I think it helps you understand that you have value as a writer and that your voice is important and you have something worthwhile to add to the conversation or to the story or to anything else. And even at the kindergarten, first grade, and second grade level, I often don't read the end of a story first and have them write the end of the story. And that is a regular activity in my classes because I really do think that's so valuable. And then to go back and read it and see what's there. And kids do often like somebody else's, even if it's not their own, maybe even a classmate's version better. But it's a lot of fun. And the kids love that. Writing a sequel is nice, but sometimes it's nice to write the end of the story and just not even know what happened first and then read it later and
Yep.
compare and contrast that as well. There's lots of ways to use that. So I think it's really valuable.
That reminds me of a quick story, if you don't mind. When I was teaching middle school literature, and I had chosen to read A Wrinkle in Time because I knew that the new movie was going to be coming out. And so I thought, okay, we are going to read it first and then we'll go see the movie. And what was very interesting was I have a student who so struggled with expressing himself. And so he was pretty quiet in class, but we came back from that movie and he said, can I write something on the board? And I'm like, sure. Right. Because he was so quiet and beautiful, beautiful student, just quiet. And I said, sure, go ahead. And he wrote this sentence up there and everybody was like waiting because he wasn't someone who expressed something usually in front of everyone. He just wrote this one sentence: Disney, I want my money back. And I thought, oh my gosh, not every kid felt that way, but every kid laughed because the interpretation that he had in his mind from the book was so different than the interpretation that was shown on the screen. And it was just a moment where he got it. After all those long chug, chug, chug writing and reading and discussing, and then come back and he was able to give a review.
Well, and what a review that was, right? How often have we as readers read a book and then they made a movie out of it? You go and see it and you're so disappointed because the book was better than the movie. Now, I do remember there's a couple of books I read that the movie was better than the book.
Yes, absolutely. So I think also that speaks a lot to the writers who were doing the interpretations as well, right?
For sure. Well, and the idea that that's a profession, that there are people who do this, I think that's
Yes.
an interesting thing to draw out for students as well. So once you have a plan and then a paragraph or multi-paragraphs, the planning that takes care of that because you've planned out how things are going to progress and by paragraph from one to the next right there. So once you understand one paragraph, doing multiple paragraphs is so much easier. That the sentence level and the paragraph level are such incredibly important building blocks that
Absolutely.
teaching students how to do that really well and not in a way that's wooden. I think so often we get into, okay, my transition words are first, next, last, versus the wide variety of transitional words that are out there that you can use. And that sometimes you don't need a transition word for everything.
Right.
Showing students, yes, this is the structure, but then it's weaning them away from some of the things they're clinging to because they start to cling to that. Okay, I can say
Absolutely.
first, next, last. And
Right.
that's a great way to start. And then we need to start expanding and drawing out. And that's where a lot of that reading comes in, doesn't it?
It does. Absolutely. It comes in at that point because then they can see how other people expand out of the first, next, last, and that they don't have to be so stiff with how they're writing. And so that's where I have several different things that I like to use, but one that I will mention here is that this is where I get the laptops out, or I'll screen share and I'll show them how to use the thesaurus that's in Word or in Google Docs. And they're always amazed. They're like, what is that? And I show them and I'm like, look at, doesn't this word work better? And then one single word can take them out of their own stuck position and make it flourish.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And I think we have to be careful about when we start to introduce that. You want to get those structures down first, and then you can start
Absolutely.
expanding. And I think sometimes we throw too much at students, but for sure.
You have to give them the tools first, and I call it your tools in your toolbox. And we even have a folder that is our toolbox folder. And those are the notes that we've taken or the ideas that we've learned, so that you have a whole thing to choose from. You don't have to do it the same way every time.
So, do you think it's important for teachers who are teaching writing to be writers themselves? And I don't mean published writers, I mean that they actually write on a regular basis.
Absolutely. I think that writing is something that you practice, and every time you practice, you get better at it. And it's just like playing a sport. You practice that sport before you ever play in the game. And even though you've played in one game, you're not done practicing. You go back and practice 2 or 3 times a week again until that season is over. And then hopefully you're practicing after that for the next season. So absolutely, it is very important that teachers write. It can be a thank you note. It can be a note to a student. It doesn't have to be a book. It doesn't have to be anything. It just could be journaling, for that matter. My mentor probably goes through a journal a month, but she also has 130 books published. But what that does is that helps her in her process.
Right. And when you think about using that sports and music idea, you hire a music teacher or you have a coach for your team, and they didn't get there by never doing what they're teaching.
Right.
You can't teach someone to play an instrument if you don't know how to play that instrument. You can't teach someone to play that sport and coach them and be a good coach if you've never actually played the sport yourself.
It takes experience. So, and if you don't have it, then it's not going to go well. And it's going to be frustrating for you as well. You're almost doing yourself a favor when you write, because then it makes it easier for you to help your students.
Sure. Just like being a book lover helps you teach children to love reading. It's the same.
Well, I have to tell you that I think that reading and writing go hand in hand. The more that you can do each one of those, the better off you are. Good readers are often good writers.
So writing is hard, even for published writers. In fact, it sometimes doesn't even ever get easier, just because each piece is new and different. And it's a struggle. It's something that isn't necessarily gets simpler. And we think of authors and we think, oh, it's got to be so easy for them. Now she has 300 books published or 10 books published, but that's not the case. So do you share your writing or your writing struggles with your students?
Oh, absolutely. I will give them instances all the time. I think it's really important for my students to know that I'm human too, and that I struggle with my process. And honestly, another thing that I do is somewhere during the year, I will actually give students a piece of my writing to critique for me, because they are my audience. And so I want to get their feedback. And so that helps them feel better about themselves. And it helps me know what I need to work on too. But if you can get rid of your ego long enough to give your students something that you've written, they will appreciate you.
Wow. I think that's really a powerful way to do that. I don't know that I've ever had students edit something I've written, but all right, I'm adding that to my toolbox. So there you go.
There you go.
So if you were going to give teachers 3 to 5 things to move forward on in writing, what might you tell them? Good places to start.
So here's the thing. You got to give them a toolbox. It doesn't matter what age group they are, you give them a toolbox. And it can be a folder, it can be a baggie, it can be whatever, but tools in there that they recognize that they can use to help them build that sentence or help them build that paragraph. Whether it's graphic organizers for the older kids, there's all kinds of tools out there for writers that like writing prompts. So you can put different writing prompts in there and let kids choose 3 to 5 that they're going to keep in their toolbox, because not every writing prompt is going to work for every kid. So a toolbox is one thing. Daily writing is another. You can't be a good writer if you don't write. That's the practice part. And being a good reader. One thing that I know that was really successful for me was, like I said, putting a picture or an image up on the screen of something in nature, and then putting on music, and then saying, you've got 15 minutes to write whatever you want about this picture. And that's like practice, right? That's like going to soccer practice and going through all of your exercises there. That writing helps build everything else. And I just can't stress that enough. So that's another one.
I love it. I think those are great tips. Just, working at that sentence level on a regular basis, working with ideas, with images and music, and the idea of just that daily writing.
And having a toolbox. You've got to have a toolbox, because I actually had a student that I saw this last summer who said he was going to be taking AP English as a junior, which was such a gratifying moment because he really struggled with writing in middle school. But he said, I still have that toolbox. And I was like, okay. And he said, it just helps him get in the mode. He may only look at 1 or 2 things. It may only take him 10 seconds, but it puts his brain in that mode that he knows what he's going to be doing.
Wow, that's phenomenal. All right, Loretta. So thank you so much. I am super excited about this episode. I think our listeners are going to love it.
So that's it, my teacher friends. I hope you enjoyed listening to Loretta as much as I enjoyed talking to her. Thanks so much for joining me today. Don't forget, I will have links to her resources and how you can contact her in the show notes. And if you like today's episode, I'd love it if you'd go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and leave a review. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Also, you can continue the conversation online with me in my Facebook group, the Teach Joyfully podcast community, where elementary teachers can connect, get help, and encouragement for all kinds of education and parenting topics. You can find the show notes on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast. And remember, a happy teacher is a good teacher. Until next time, teach joyfully and take care of you.